Welcome again. This webinar is brought to you by the Ohio Employee-Owned Network, part of the OEOC at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. We are a nonprofit training and outreach organization located right on the campus of Kent State. We focus on ESOP transitions and training. Today we have Chris Mackin, President of Ownership Associates in Boston, snowy Boston I might add. The title of Chris's presentation is Explaining Ownership Culture. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, ESOP friends, wherever you may be. Looking forward to this, and please feel free to chat it up in the chat box there. We'll do the best we can to stay in touch with you over this hour while I go through this material. First things first, we've got a little preface here. If we can move to the, to the agenda of what we're going to talk about today. You see we've got a preface about what this webinar is about, and another topic that I'm calling regulatory politics and justificatory science. That's a fancy word. I'll explain it. The heart of the agenda follows from that. My training is as an organizational psychologist. I've been in the field for many years, since the late 1970s. Got a doctorate, wrote a thesis called The Social Psychology of Ownership. What we're about to talk about today is what has been interesting me for a long time. And we're going to take a little tour through what I call the simple psychology of ownership. Then I want to talk about ownership vision and the importance of ownership vision from the senior most levels of your organizations. We're then going to drill deeper into the more complex dimensions of what ownership psychology is. We will then talk about the relationship of ownership and participation, where the rubber meets the road, and then some concluding comments. Okay, so the preface. What is this webinar about? This webinar is about the culture dimension of things, about people, about how people understand, misunderstand what ownership means. It's not, this is not a session about ESOP administration, about vesting schedules and distribution formulas and allocation formulas and the like, just to be clear. In terms of what I'm calling the background of regulatory politics, it's also important to know before we get into this, for those of you in particular who are new to the ESOP world, what we're about to talk about this morning is entirely permissive work. It's not mandatory. If you have installed an ESOP recently and you're making your necessary filings with the federal government and following the rules and regulations, that is in fact all you have to do by and large. Congress sets a very modest floor about your producing those summary plan descriptions and issuing annual account statements and pass-through voting, and for those of you who've done that, and voting on supermajority issues. That's the substance of what you're required to do. What we're going to be talking about today is what you can do beyond that minimum. You set the ceiling, in other words. Congress sets the floor, you set the ceiling. And there's a fork in the road, and you choose it. You can choose to fly low and emphasize the ESOP as a financial benefit, as merely a retirement plan, or you can fly high and start the journey towards an ownership culture and unpacking the meaning of ownership, which is, again, the substance of today's session. Why opt for the second of these options? Well, the science is pretty clear about what differences result from digging into culture. Many folks stop at this first step in the way and look at ESOPs as primarily a passive incentive, something that's mentioned maybe when you're at the hiring interview and it's thought to be a financial incentive. If that's the only way in which you talk about it, then the science shows that you'll get a low to medium return on your investment. It's really -1% to 2%. The social science shows that if you do invest in these ideas and sorting out just what they're going to mean to you, then the returns are potentially much higher. The next slide makes the same point. This is an old study now, but it's been looked over very closely. You can look at expected growth rates of closely held companies before and after they've set up an ESOP. That's the yellow line. All ESOPs, there's a little bit of a bounce that you might get from talking about the ESOP as a benefit and from just instituting it. But the red line, and in particular the difference between the green line and the red line, is what's at stake here in terms of why to invest in the idea of an ownership culture. So let's do it. Back to the agenda. Simple psychology. Let's start with simple psychology. May I introduce you to Mr. Gumby Man, and he's got a story to tell. And this is the story. There's a standard employment deal we learn about coming out of high school. Our parents tell us about it. You go to work for 8 hours, you get 8 hours pay. That is the common threshold starting point of how people think about and expect to relate to the workplace as they first join the workforce. What's different here? Well, at the simplest level, we're adding a dimension here of ownership rewards, that you're not just working for a paycheck, you are part of ownership, and you are in line to share in those rewards. And the hope, of course, is that if you begin to think of yourselves as part owners, you'll be putting in the ideas and effort to make that happen. Excuse the noise in the background as the snow plows go by. Oh boy, we have all right, well, hopefully it isn't too bad. There's a snow blower happening outside my office window here. We've got 10 inches of snow on the ground. So let's break this down a little bit further with Mr. Gummy Man, because this, because this is too simple a way of looking at ideas and effort. There's in fact more detail to be understood. The individual worker relates first at the level of his job and second at the level of his department. That's how ideas and effort are generated. The reward side in an ESOP environment comes through an increase in stock value that's passed through the ESOP to the worker. So one sees the simple, again, possible, virtuous circle here of individual performance, department performance, increases the stock value, you're an ESOP participant, it comes back to you. There's one other dimension to this, simple psychology, that I'd like to, it looks like I've got a slide in there that mentions a client. I didn't mean to do that. That's a client called HAC. This is the added dimension here is profit sharing. There's a good deal of agreement that adding in some form of near-term economic participation to go along with the ESOP, which is, as I think people generally know, is a long-term proposition, is a prudent thing to do. How am I doing, Jay, in terms of the background noise? Is this
You're fine, Chris. You're
okay.
good.
Okay. The guy's right outside my window. Okay, so this concludes the simple psychology way of talking about ownership, and let's now switch to talking about ownership vision and why getting your head straight, getting your company's thinking straight about what ownership is all about is important. There are a couple of dimensions to this. The goal, however, should be to achieve unity, a clear, consistent, and compelling message from the top down. You want that to happen internally among employees as best you can, and ideally you want to be able to broadcast that externally to your customers and suppliers. There are different challenges in achieving that for firms that are converting from a prior form of ownership or family ownership and are carrying a story about what the vision of the company is and from the past. So there's a retrofit activity that needs to go on. And there's a potential strength that's out there in this idea that everyone, in fact, has a theory of ownership, that ownership is not a abstracted technical concept. It's the province of lawyers and consultants and engineers. Everyone has a theory of ownership. That's a strength of it. It's a very culturally accessible concept. That same strength is, of course, a weakness, that everyone has a theory of ownership. Now, does that mean if you've got, let's say, 300 people in your company that you've got 300 different theories of ownership out there? No, that's not. That would be too dramatic and negative. You don't. You probably have 4 or 5 different theories of ownership that are competing for attention around the water cooler or at the lunch table. But understanding that you have different theories and then doing something about trying to achieve more unity, you're never going to achieve perfect unity, is again one of the purposes of this session. There are 2 dimensions to that. There's a breadth dimension we're going to talk about here for a minute, about the spectrum of possible meanings of ownership. And there's a depth dimension about like what's inside this concept of ownership. And we'll talk about rights, responsibilities, risks, and rewards. Let's talk about the breadth first. Here's a sampling. What you hear if I joined you at your company and spent a couple days and talked to different people informally about what they believe ownership means, this is a sampling of what people would say if you gave them a sentence completion test and asked them, what does ownership mean? A lot of this is, some just look at it as an incentive or a benefit. Others focus on the risk and possible sacrifices. Others jump right to the more political dimensions of it, that it should have something to do with having more of a say, involvement, in democracy. Some think of it in terms of equality. This is the kind of typical sort of fruit salad starting points of the breadth of ownership that any organization is likely dealing with. Well, let's see if we can't bring some order to that chaos. Here's a question that gets asked by our friends at the National Center for Employee Ownership with something called the Ownership Culture Survey. I'm going to ask you on your own to sort of take this question yourself in a second. But this is a question that's posed in that survey instrument that is sold by NCEO. And I should say the original survey, the Ownership Culture Survey, was developed here at Ownership Associates in the late 80s and early 90s. And we sold it to NCEO about 8 or 10 years ago. They do a great job managing it. This is one of the questions. How important are each of the following aspects of ownership to you? Getting the maximum financial payoff, having a say over decisions that affect my daily work, employees having real influence in how companies run overall, a sense of community that we're in this all together, or being treated fairly. So again, the background question here, or the background challenge in some sense, is recognizing that different people in your organization are tuning in to this concept at probably at one of these five levels more than other places. They may be tuning in at more than one level, but people do give priority to these different things, and it's important to try to understand what the starting point is. So I ask you, where do you place yourself on this breadth meaning of ownership spectrum? That's the question. And here are the options again. I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to drink a cup of coffee. You might write down yourself where you are, and maybe write down a couple of words from each of these selections, A through E. And then what we're going to do is show you the most recent cumulative results from the NCEO database based on 7,500 respondents at 40 different ESOP companies. So see where your answer fits with what the rest of the nation thinks about this. Here's the results. Number one priority is being treated fairly. That's the first. These differences are close, as you can see, but in fact that is a statistically significant difference between fairly and the rest of them. The second most cited reason for people to talk about what's important about ownership is a sense of community. The third, right behind it, is financial payoff. The fourth is having a say over decisions that affect my daily work. And the last is employees having real influence over how the company is run overall. That's often referred to as the corporate governance thing. A corporate governance desire, appetite. So there's a spectrum, and I think what needs to be said, and let's talk about it a little bit, is that, actually I want to go back. What needs to be said here is that these are latent values that exist in any organization before you had an ESOP. The concerns about fairness, appetite for community, concerns about financial payoff, having a say, and even having a say at the corporate governance level are not particular to the ESOP experience. I think what the ESOP experience does, what ownership does, is it brings these dimensions out in a more prominent way. And you are dealing now with a workforce that has a more particular appetite to want some kind of response, some kind of means by which they can experience and do something about making the organization more fair. Do something about creating a sense that we're in all this together and the like. So, by way of getting back to what this might mean for you, this is a kind of a task. It suggests that if you haven't done it, that you do it. With or without the guidance of a consultant. A consultant can be helpful in organizing this kind of information and data. But getting clear about what your ownership vision is at your organization and having that reflected in your internal documents, in the messaging that you do internally and externally, is an important task of explaining ownership culture, the purpose of this webinar. Okay, let's move on to the next level. We're going to go beyond Gumby Man, and we're going to look inside ownership. We've talked about the breadth of ownership. Now we're drilling down and getting on the inside. And we're going beyond simple notions of motivation, and this image here of the scales of justice is deliberate because, as you'll see in a minute, a lot of what is required here is a balanced perspective among what appear to be competing values, but I can assure you they can be reconciled. So let's do this. Now I liken this this little journey we're taking here next to sort of simple high school chemistry. We might all remember taking high school chemistry, and there's this thing called fractional distillation. Remember, you had to boil down different liquids and see what was inside. Well, that's I think a useful metaphor for trying to understand what ownership is, that it has these different component pieces to it. We're going to first talk about what those pieces are, to drill it down. The first distinction to be made is between a set of issues that relate to what I call organizational life, membership or people issues, and there's a second dimension of economic life, business and money issues. Ownership is about both of these dimensions. The first box, organizational life, gives rise to a set of concerns and issues around the rights and responsibilities of ownership, and the second, economic life, gives rise to a set of ways of thinking about the risks and rewards of ownership. Now, why the distinction and what's important here? What's important is that people understand that employee-owned companies are not just one box or the other. They're not, again, we have to have a balance. They're not just organizational life settings where, like debate clubs or political parties or whatever, because they have to live and survive and succeed in a market economy, in a competitive economy. So there's got to be a reconciliation of the democracy debate dimension, if you will, with the compete, survive, and understand what's going on in the market dimension. That's what's distinct about employee-owned companies. All right, I talked about this idea of balance. Well, here it is. So for every right of ownership that you can imagine, I would wager that there's a corresponding responsibility, and that's in fact the good news. Every right that you or your employees can imagine should follow from ownership is in fact matched somehow in nature with a corresponding responsibility. So that if you're interested in having a voice as an employee owner, well, the corresponding responsibility is that you recognize that all voices are not necessarily alike on every issue, and that you need to recognize expertise. If employees as a group want to have more influence over what's going on in the company, well, it's fair enough for the organization to expect you to show a greater level of commitment. Similarly, on the economic life dimension of things, every reward of ownership that you can imagine has a corresponding risk. You want to have that bonus or the economic return that you dream of, well, it's fair enough for the organization to expect you to have to innovate or invest in order to get there. That's the definitional side. How is this stuff perceived? And this is where I first joined the party in terms of my research work and academic work, is I wanted to understand how these ideas are understood by people. Well, it appears that there are three different groupings, which I'll dig into. There are people who focus on the rewards and the rights-only side of things. There are people who focus on the risks and the responsibilities-only things. And then there are people who do recognize that these concepts exist in some kind of a balance, and there's usually kind of a developmental continuum of people's understanding and appreciation of that. Let me illustrate that a little bit with some concepts. The rights-only and the rewards-only people tend to have an individualistic or egoistic, me first, us first view of ownership. The responsibilities-only and risks-only people in the organization tend to have a paternalistic attitude about what ownership means. And then those who see it as a balance are people who are beginning to talk about ownership and the idea of an employee-owned environment as being a culture of partnership, of membership, of people being in this together. But what's the starting point of doing this? Well, I'm sorry, wait a minute, there's one more here. And this is an important distinction I forgot to mention, is that what I presented here is itself a little too simplistic, because there's another whole category of people besides this group, and this group. There is, in fact, a larger category of people we might call ownership skeptics, this sort of red ocean around these different boxes. People who you can't really tell what they're thinking. They're sort of holding back and seeing what what's meant by this concept. Where is this coming from? They may be hopeful. They may be apprehensive. You don't know. But that tends to sort of describe the universe. Another way of talking about how these concepts often, not always, can be found in organizations, particularly at the starting point. You've got management as a group that's generally negative or skeptical about the rights of ownership, and they're positive about the responsibilities. They're positive about risks, and they're negative about rewards. Their theory of ownership might be summarized as the following. Employees should act like owners, sit down, and be quiet. That is often how it sounds and looks from on top. We've got how this looks from lower in the organization. You've got office or shop floor workers who are positive about the rights of ownership, but they're negative about responsibilities. They're negative about risks, and they're positive about rewards. Their theory of ownership is type 2. Treat me like an owner and like an employee. I want all the good stuff about ownership, but when the whistle blows at 5 o'clock, I'm out of here. That's, in fact, the harsh truth or whatever, or the real truth of how many organizations start out on this journey. And then what do we have? We've got a red line in the middle. This is the standard model. The starting point for many ESOPs is what I call a cultural continental divide, where you've got these different views of ownership that are actually quite different, and they need to be reconciled. Now, I'm going to try the chat box to see if we can have a quiz, and I know some of you out there. So what would happen, what kind of a metaphor could we use if we got pluses in each of those boxes? Would anybody like to chat it up there in the box? What would result? What would we get? I'm going to give 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nobody's speaking up. So this is what we get. We get a balance. That's, again, the scales of justice. If this is the starting point of the problem, if we are, in fact, going to build positive ownership cultures, we have to figure out ways of getting pluses in each of these boxes. And if we do, we get that sense of balance. If we don't invest in this, if we aren't paying attention to it, what are some potential risks? Well, here are four kind of cultural potholes, if you will, that organizations can fall into if they're not attending to this, into these ideas. You can have a culture that becomes rights-heavy, that emphasizes rights over responsibilities, what I call referendum ownership. You can have cultures that are responsibilities-heavy, that emphasize responsibilities too much over risks. That's paternalistic ownership. You can have companies that are just hammering away at risks as being what's going on when people maybe know that a lot of money has been made and it's not being shared. I call that Scrooge ownership. Or you can have companies that are emphasizing rewards without paying due enough attention to the risks, to the economic survivability and sustainability of the organization. We might call that plundering ownership. So these are the potholes you want to avoid on this journey, and this is why it makes sense, at least from our point of view here, to be thoughtful about what is going on in people's minds and hearts about the meaning of ownership, and why it makes sense to sort of take this on and talk to people about ownership.
Chris?
Yes.
I think this balance metaphor you're using is really great. You can see it graphically on Chris's slides here. The previous slide where you talked about rights and responsibilities and a balance between those, especially in a new ESOP, I think that's often or very commonly misunderstood. And the example that you had on your slide was, if my right, I'm in the ESOP and I'm a new participant in the ESOP, therefore I'm an employee owner, therefore I should be able to voice and I should be able to influence decision making, okay? And you're balancing that with the responsibility to have expertise in the area that we asked you to voice your influence, okay? I think that's often misunderstood. One of the first questions that comes up with a new employee owner in an ESOP is, well, now that I'm an owner, I can help make decisions in every single area.
Right.
And
well,
maybe I'll be able to vote on every decision. Well, that's not a practical case.
That's right, and we're going to get into that in particular in the last section of this presentation. So, well played, as they say. But the before we leave the psychology behind here, and we're not going to leave it entirely behind, but before we leave it behind, one question might be, well, what can you do about the variety of perceptions that exist in your organization? Is there anything that can be done to bring them in line? Well, I'm here to tell you that the answer is yes. You can and should open the door and invite people to talk about ownership. One way of talking about it is what I showed you before in terms of the different aspects of ownership, and to find out what priority people give different dimensions, and maybe use that ownership culture survey to give you some data to do that. Another training exercise that we help companies with is something called rights and responsibilities groups. This is a face-to-face sort of small group training program that makes use of cases that are customized cases that are fictionalized, but that are nonetheless drawn from some part of the story of your company, that they resemble what's going on in your company, and where we have characters that take different points of view, that take maybe a point of view that Jay just mentioned of someone who's demanding to have a vote over everything, and maybe somebody who's not that sure, and a technical person who's supposed to be doing something that they may or may not be doing right. This particular case talks about people coming to work one morning and finding out that there's new inventory software that's been installed, and many of the workers don't feel that they were consulted on this, and they had no idea that it was coming, they claim. And there's the reaction that is given and talked about in the case is people using this concept of, well, I thought we were owners, and they're not even listening to us about these kinds of issues. So we have a case. It's usually a one-page, at most two-page case that illustrates that kind of a little drama. And the idea is to get people into small groups and to use the raw material of the case to talk about the complexities, to talk about what's really going on, and to use the fictional characters as a way of having a safer discussion than can perhaps be had by talking directly about your company. There is, at the end of this exercise, an opportunity to say, okay, if we've done this and if this resembles what's going on here in the company, now let's talk about how this exercise that we've all had together resembles reality, and how we can potentially improve things at our company by talking candidly to each other about it. So this is something I'm glad to talk to people about more who are interested. This just to tell you there's a way to actually work with these abstract psychological concepts I've been sharing with you. In fact, presenting the storyline about the rights and responsibilities and the balances is usually what precedes people doing the case study. Now to switch to the topic that Jay was really just talking about. Here we go, here, I think. Why is this not switching? Here we go, okay. Ownership and participation. You say where the rubber meets the road. And the kind of situation that Jay was describing, where people are trying to understand where they fit, what how they have a say over matters or don't have a say over matters. Well, the first thing to stress here is that when talking about employee ownership in your organizations, involvement in decision-making is not inevitable, but expectations about involvement are inevitable. You start talking of the language of ownership and calling people owners, you have increased their appetite and their expectations that they should be included somehow in their organization's deliberations and decisions. And here's again from the Ownership Culture Survey some sample comments. While most of the survey is a standard Likert scale 5 or 7 point choice of where you are in the spectrum, there's always an opportunity for people to write directly about what they believe ownership means. And here are 3 representative comments that employees make: that ownership implies decision making. Let me have a say where appropriate in company decisions, people have said. And another person said, for ownership to work, things must be done democratically. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but how does that jibe with being able to run a professional competitive organization? Well, another piece of news from the survey that is reassuring in this regard is that while people have an appetite to participate, that doesn't mean that they lose their rationality. In fact, the data is very strong in response to this question from the survey, but I think that on some issues, I should leave the decision-making to managers with specialized knowledge. There's strong agreement there. What do we have? 63% agree strongly with that concept. And so there is a sense in companies that while people want to participate more, they want a condition that's connected, and probably more than one condition that's connected to that participation, and that is, again, to recognize expertise. Okay, so that leads to the next point. And this is my favorite quote of our friend Corey Rosen. I'm guessing that most everyone, he's actually not the executive director anymore. What's his title, Jay, do you remember? It's the executive director or whatever. He's retired eminence grise at NCEO. Lauren Rogers, who actually used to work with me here for 9 years, is now the executive director of the NCEO. But this is a quote from Corey. He says, employee involvement happens not because you allow it, but because you structure it. And that's the last theme we're going to get into here, is this issue of structure and how to think about it. But this quote really does capture something, because management people of goodwill are across the land always talk about their open doors and how they will allow things to happen. And those same managers are often frustrated by there not being enough energy and appetite and involvement. The point being made here is that that's because they're not recognizing the importance of structure. And management in particular has to have something to do with helping initiate it and helping get the ball rolling about structure. But how do we think about structuring decision-making? Well, here's a standard list of corporate decisions that any organization has to deal with, ranging from production speed and equipment layout and asset purchases, going all the way over here to raising capital and technology strategy and the like. This is a standard list. So how do we think about participation in an employee-owned company? Well, let's put these ideas on a y-axis, from the simplest to the most complex. The standard management model, simplified, is that there are 3 groups that handle these decisions. There's management decisions. There's a board that handles certain kinds of oversight of senior management, for example, and reinvestment. And there's a small stripe of decisions that are handled by shareholders. Well, the challenge, if in some sense the question of an employee-owned culture, is whether this is the end of history, whether we can't do better, and we can do better. And so here's an example of doing better, where we can imagine carving out a discrete decision-making ideas and pushing responsibility down to committees and task forces under the red zone there and work teams, for example. This is something we call an influence allocation chart or a zone chart, which is for illustrative purposes only. This is generic. And you'll see there's a sort of a spectrum of different forms of democracy, if you will, that are appropriate to each of the clusters of decisions. In the work teams, this is probably more of a consensus model of people sitting around and figuring things out. In the committees and task forces, there might be a decision rule that where management and the and the committee have some kind of shared influence. In the green zone, excuse me for getting a drink of water here. The green zone is what I call an opportunity for consultative influence. There's a lot of rich, important decisions here, but as we'll see in a minute, there are even possibilities for involvement in this area. There are board decisions, and there are shareholder decisions. And there's something kind of buried in here that of our invention here at Ownership Associates that's you can't find in any textbook. It's what we call constitutionalism, the setting and moving of the decision-making boundaries. Who gets to draw these lines? Different groups that we've worked with over the years choose to put that up with the shareholders, the workers. Some put it with management, some put it with the board. I'm partial with that being with the board myself, but it's just responding to what should be an obvious question. If this is compelling in some fashion, it's who has control over it, and who. How do we think about moving these boundaries themselves? And that of course reminds me of the quick detour into your high school literature class. Why this this general concept of zone charts and influence allocation charts seems to have some appeal in the market. When I first started thinking about that after giving presentations on this at ESOP meetings, I was reminded of the Robert Frost poem that we all learned in high school called Mending Wall, and you'll remember the line from that poem that says, "Good fences make good neighbors." And why this kind of an exercise, if you use it in your company, might be useful is that it's reassuring to everyone, but perhaps particularly to management, that if you have an influence allocation chart you've worked on yourself, that people will know where they stand. And by the virtue of there being fences, there'll be an appetite for being neighborly. The second part of that Frost poem, if you dig into it, however, gets you right up there to number 20, because the poem actually leads off with the line that something there is in us that does not love a wall. People want to know that these walls may be necessary, but in a healthy organization, they should develop or change over time. And again, that's why there has to be some thought given to who controls where these lines are drawn. Now, figuring out who makes the decisions is really just one dimension of the whole participation opportunity in employee-owned companies. This is an important piece, figuring out who gets to do what. But let's just imagine in this green zone where management's assured that they're going to be making the decisions over, things like product and technology strategy, for example. They're the ones who are going to be able to make the decision. But the good news here is that there are ways in which employees can be invited into the process of helping with product and technology strategy, where if management can invite and have there be a place where people can initiate ideas about that. They can be sent to help gather information. They can generate alternatives. They can make a recommendation. But then the decision making, again, remains and is clarified at the very beginning with the management team. There's another task to be had to inform people about decisions that are made, and then how to review decisions. This literally shows opportunities beyond just figuring out who does what, potentially getting employees involved even in each other's different zones. And I'm actually going to skip, because we're getting a little close on time, I'm going to skip through these. There's a closer look at these 7 steps, which people can do on their own. We're going to make this presentation available to people who get in touch with me. I'll be glad to share it with you. I think I thought I saw, I don't know if he's still on, but one of our friends from Karis Reels did this exercise with us many years ago. At the time, they had about 1,000 employees at 8 different locations, and they wanted to do one of these influence allocation charts. And it was interesting. Before the ESOP, I asked them, how did they, we first of all customized the y-axis for them, and we asked them in a meeting that happened, let's say it was in 2005, or even before that, how they would portray who gets to make what decisions. Well, this is how it was before the ESOP, and this is how it was at that point in time. We then asked people the aspirational question: how would they like things to be? And there was the statement of the present time, and here was the image that the CEO, the president, Bill Karis, of the founding family himself had. You could see he had an appetite to push responsibility further down and to eliminate layers of supervision and have people, take responsibility themselves. And that's, in fact, what they did, and they moved in this way. Karis makes use of this tool, and in particular that 7-step decision-making model and things called decision reports, which we could talk about some other time. All right, let me bring this to a close. We've got 10 minutes left. 5 culture lessons learned. There's that guy, Corey Rosen, with that quote. But here it is. This is to sort of summarize, why invest time in thinking about explaining ownership and doing what I've outlined for you here this morning. Is the first question you need to ask yourself: is this basic maintenance versus a business strategy? Is it in the budget? Do you care enough about getting clear and getting sharper about these ideas and moving towards creating an ownership culture? Well, the answer to that question is it in the budget? Are people going to be measured in management for what they do to make this happen? That's a question I'd ask you to ask yourselves. The second point I'd make is that what doesn't get related, what doesn't get measured, doesn't get done. That's an argument for survey data, for getting a sense of how your workforce thinks about these issues and being able to sort of track progress. Because without there being some empirical dimension to building an ownership culture, you're really trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, because you're talking about interpretations and concepts and intuitions and impressions about how people get it or don't get it. This is very important stuff, and it needs science. It needs some approximation of science and engineering, if you will, and that's possible, and there are tools out there for you to use. Data is important, but also stories. For those of you in management leadership, it's crucial, I would say, to remind people why this was done in the first place. Why did you choose the ESOP? Because these ESOPs do tend to come out of nowhere, and it is a mistake to restrict your education to the mechanics of the allocation and investing formulas, and even the concepts we've been talking about today, if the actual story of why this ESOP was introduced is not made clear to employees. Is it done to and it's usually done for a combination of reasons. But whatever that combination is, whatever the emphasis is, it's critical for the employees to hear that. Was it done to add a benefit? Was it done in part to create a tax-favored exit for an owner? Was it done because of some sense of commitment and fairness on the part of a founding family that wanted to leave the company in the hands of the people who made it successful? Whatever that story is, it needs to be told. The fourth, I would emphasize the importance of ownership rituals, annual shareholder meetings in particular. People need to be looking at each other. They need to, in large groups, they need to see each other as a group, as best you can do that. I emphasize that's important. And then I'd say open doors, again, are never enough, and that's the Corey quote that employee involvement happens not because you allow it, but because you structure it. That's a sort of a summary. Here's another way of contextualizing what we've talked about here this morning. We've talked about really, this is a way of breaking down the entire kind of ownership culture challenge of different things that need to be taught. You need to teach about ownership facts, about how the ESOP works. You need to teach about financial concepts and business concepts. That's what I call ownership skills. But you also need to talk about ownership values, the day-to-day meaning of ownership. And this number 3, was the largest part of the presentation this morning. It is a discrete part that I believe deserves attention. And then the bottom 3 boxes are more about structures and about reward systems. How do we actually organize ourselves to optimize involvement? And I think I've just got 2 more slides here. Generally speaking, this work happens in at least in 3 phases. There's some initial, for those of you who are new, there's some ownership message that needs to get out in awareness. Then there's ownership training, and that's usually in these first 3 boxes I talk about, and that's usually followed logically by investing in ownership structures. I like the term ownership improvement committees for what people call an ESOP committee, but I'd like to emphasize here are 4 things for them to do. I don't have time to get into all of this right now, but they should be doing community and team building, should be doing the place where education happens. It should be the home of your process improvement efforts at the company, and it should also be a home where people are invited to brainstorm about the future of the company and what the company could be doing down the road, even into new products and services. With that being, again, suggestions that not necessarily delegating the investment decisions here, but it should be a place where people can think about the future. I like to say one way of thinking about involvement is that it's a combination of ongoing bureaucratic training efforts. Getting people sitting down and listening and talking to each other, looking at data and the like. That's the balanced diet. That's Woody Hayes' 3 yards in a cloud of dust. That's the regular stuff. But you also need to do major events. You need to get people together, looking at each other, talking to each other. That's the annual shareholder meeting idea, which I think is a shot of espresso. And that's it. Thank you very much. And that's how you get a hold of me. About that, 4 minutes left.
Wow. Well, we've got some time for some chat questions if anybody has any. I'm sure they do. Chris, thanks so much. What a wealth of information in 57 minutes. Incredible. Ownership culture is a huge topic and hugely important to our ESOP companies. And I think we would all agree that it's an ongoing process. Making the decision to develop an ownership culture is never-ending and an ongoing challenge. But the decision has to be made to go there. I would return to, again, Corey's quote. I think it's fabulous. Employee involvement happens not because you allow it, but because you structure it.
Right.
He was addressing employee involvement, of course, which is a piece of the culture, maybe a J quote in follow-up to that would be, ownership culture happens not by accident, but because leadership decides it's a good thing. Can you spend 1 minute talking about the role of leadership, and hopefully when I'm saying leadership, the leadership resides in top management?
Right. Well, yes, I can. That was Jay. That was the reason early on. Excuse my doing this to your eyeballs. That was what was meant by the sort of the second part of the presentation here, in terms of this, the shared ownership vision. This is this is something. And I'm glad you raised that, because I maybe wasn't clear. This is a place where you often need to start. You need to get the leadership of the organization, away from the phones and sitting down and saying, what do we mean by this? What are we trying to achieve? And because they're the people who decided to enter into this, and they need to come to some consensus about what their objectives are for this. And so having that kind of ownership vision starts at the top, and I see that Rita Tucker is making that same point. And that's why it's a mistake to just jump into the pool wherever you find whatever you happen to find interesting without having your leadership, embrace this idea and to give you the space to do the work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Ken has.
How do we go about getting a copy of this presentation? What's the? I think maybe if people could email me, is that okay, Jay? Is that a way to?
Yeah, we can do it in a couple ways. Let's slide back to the very end.
Okay. Yeah. Hang on. Sorry, that must be a way of doing it.
Two ways for those people that would like a copy of the presentation. We'll give you Chris's email address, and you can just email Chris and have him do that. Or following this session, you will get an email feedback form asking you to give us some input on what you thought of the presentation. And in that feedback, you could give me your name and email address, and I will pass that on to Chris. So either way would be just fine.
I'd suggest you unmute for 30 seconds so we can actually hear that. I don't believe there are any humans back there. Why don't you unmute, see if anybody wants to
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Hello.
Good morning.
I hope you liked it. I hope this was useful.
Yep.
Oh, absolutely.
Great. Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to hear some voices out there.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes. Yes, whoever you are.
If anybody would like to voice a question, go right ahead.
Keep your snow.
Could you hear the snowblower outside?
Yeah, but it wasn't as bad as you thought it was, so it's okay.
It's still snowing. It's still snowing.
Thank you. Please stand by.